And I think it's a tribute to Barnes, the parishioners, the congregation, the rectors who have been part of this church. What a thriving and successful building space this building has become. So I'm going to start by doing some reading, and you'll bear with me. I shall try and pace it and animate it so it isn't like the phone book, so we'll see how we go. A warm welcome to you all is the first thing I put, and I hope warmer than being wet outside. The 20th Century Society was kind enough to invite me to introduce this evening's proceedings with a description of the context and process involved in the development of the church you see before you, as a prelude to discussion and question and answer session, considering its significance and its standing, and that's in the broadest sense. For some of you, this will be a well-rehearsed story. For others, perhaps new news. Either way, I hope it will provide an opportunity not just to look at what was created, as you just have, but to see what was created and understand at least some of the whys and hows and wherefores involved in the project. Our story begins in 1978/9. There was the fire in 1978. We were appointed eventually after a selection process, when Edward Cullinan Architects was invited to participate in a selection process which aimed to appoint an architect for rebuilding the historic church of St. Mary Barnes, which had been substantially destroyed by arson attack. We accordingly expressed our interest and duly visited the site, only to discover the burnt-out remains of the church after an inferno that had essentially left only the perimeter walls and tower standing, and a site strewn with all manner of debris. The parish wished to rebuild from these ruins, and the PCC had formed a committee to conduct the process. They had evolved a 13-point brief to inform their endeavour. As might be expected, the brief covered matters such as capacity, content, and liturgical features. Significantly, after 12 points, point 13 intriguingly stated, or anything else that the architect might wish to suggest. We also learned that the parish had discovered that the premises were significantly underinsured relative to the cost of a like-for-like construction. With all this in mind, we duly and keenly provided references and examples of our work for consideration. We're shortlisted, I think from 20 down to 7 or 5, and attended an interview. During the back and forth at this interview, Ted Cullinan was poignantly asked what his attitude to the beyond was. He tactfully explained that he was raised a Catholic, but now considered himself agnostic. To which the rector responded amiably by explaining the beyond he was referring to was not a matter of faith, but to whether Edward Cullinan believed an apsidal space was a necessary architectural feature. The PCC, that's Parochial Church Council, then made a visit to Edward Cullinan's notable work at Minster Lovell Mill. If you're familiar with his work, I'm sure you enjoy it. If you're not, you should become familiar with it, because it's his first great exercise in beyond individual houses into working in context and transforming the old to the new, where the fabric of old and new built form had been skillfully married to create a numinous and harmonious whole, without resort to pastiche. So he's working in the Cotswolds, but he didn't build something that just looked like a copy of a Cotswold building. And it was a conference centre for the study of a particular disorder in children. And in the event, eventually, it was never occupied. The initiative closed and it became, I think, a hotel. The cordial interview dialogue and Minster Lovell tour had apparently proved enough to convince the parish to entrust the commission to Edward Cullinan Architects, and after receiving formal ratification by the Diocese of Southwark, we were appointed. It was to be the beginning of a 5-year journey involving some 4 years of intense liturgical soul-searching, reflection, much design and redesign, parish and local consultation, open public debate, fundraising, and the gaining of no less than 13 formal consents, ranging from the Borough of Richmond, the listed building consent. The scheme went to the Royal Fine Arts Commission. I presented the scheme at a consistory court to Mervyn Stockwood at East Sheen Church, and so forth, over and over and over and over. And each time we came back, and if we needed to adjust and reconsider, we met the committee and did so, and kept going. In a process of hypothesis and test, a scheme was gradually developed to do justice to the genius loci, spirit of place, history, form, and fabric of this holy site, and provide a versatile place for both spiritual communion and community. As I reflected while preparing this talk, I was reminded of the many evenings, many evenings, on which we convened at Barnes with the committee, and how at each meeting, at the start and at the end, a prayer was offered up, asking that the proceedings and decision-making be guided by the humility and wisdom necessary to come to a right and just conclusion. The church that you are visiting today will hopefully properly speak for itself as an architectural entity, and you are, of course, sitting in its actual space. But to assist your appreciation and understanding, I will now take you on a brief illustrated tour to explain how we came to find a path that could balance the needs of liturgy, community, and site, and achieve a rebuilding fit to take its place in history, with an implicit spirit of inevitability and homecoming. The inevitability reference comes from a comment by Peter Smithson, who had taught Edward Cullinan at the Architectural Association, who, during a crit, not of Ted's work, I'm sure, said to a student whose work he was not quite enjoying, "You should always ask yourself, when you stand back from your work and look at it, does it contain inevitability?" The homecoming is from a quotation by the great Dutch writer and architect Aldo van Eyck, contemporary of Ted's, who in a pithy note remarked, "Architecture need only assist man's homecoming." And as a quotation, as an apt tenet for arriving at a design for a holy space, a space for reflection, meditation, and so forth, there is a theme, a well-known premise, which is that the life of mankind is essentially concerned with coming home. And a church is a place where, when you're on that journey, it should support that coming home. Nostos is the word. So now to the pictures, where I will become freer in the delivery, I think. And this is your, I'm afraid, guinea pigs. This will cheer you up. This is my first PowerPoint presentation. Like Edward Cullinan, I'm an analogue man. I think we'll be all right. What I'm going to do is, I can see what's happening here, you can see what's there, and I'm going to trust that they're talking to one another. So let's go. So we were just outside looking at the, I'll look over my shoulder, looking at the outside, and you can see the ensemble that we created, which is like a small hamlet of buildings in a sense. It's a medieval church in the foreground that you've passed through there, and you've got the remains of a former vestry, and you've got a piece of wall with some windows in it, and you've got what looks like a clear story with a pitched roof coming down, forming, as it were, a backdrop to all of that. When you see it from the road, or indeed from the front of the churchyard, what you see is a medieval church in its land, with all of those things to the rear eclipsed. So what happens is, as you move further into the scene, you start to understand it's in a context, but that context unfolds as you move through space. And so this is a very different kind of making of architecture than just dropping, or parachuting as you might say, a church into the middle of a green space and going, there's your church then, what style do you want it in? This is actually about dynamic movement in space, transparency, moving around, context, and all that enjoys depending on orientation. So that's it at completion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a number of images that talk of how you get to that. When we arrived, that pretty much summarizes what we found, which is fallen angels. And we're going to meet those fallen angels again later in this series of pictures. These are beautiful carved pieces of stone that have survived God knows how much heat and then been hosed down by the fire brigade, picked out of the rubble on the ground. This is the interior as we found it. The skeleton of medieval beams, rafters and so forth, an arcade, stone columns, well fried. You can see a very damaged font here in the foreground. And this view is, later on you can revisit it because it's behind you. If you went down just into the medieval part of the church and looked east, this is east, very important, I should give you the orientation. South, east, west, north. It's going to become important later. That's the condition of it after the fire. That's how it looked from the outside, and you'll detect now some features of this church which are less graceful than they are today, I would beg to say. The medieval church is pebble-dashed, like a suburban house, which was done at some point to tidy it up because the rubble and stone and handmade bricks from the Tudor period that had raised the roof were considered by some untidy, I think. And the gentleman who used to live in the rectory next door described the rest of it. He was an architect. He was pleased to meet us. He said, I hope you're going to get rid of the vertical crazy paving and the ragstone that was applied to the brick building that extended to the north. And that's a monument, a tomb monument that's outside, just in the foreground there. But you can see it's in, even if it hadn't had a fire, you might say, architecturally speaking, it's in a sorry state considering its provenance. Oh, do I do it that way? Yep. So now here you see the whole of the churchyard, fully filled. And you can see that the medieval little chapel there on the south side here is actually overtaken by a very large central aisle that's been built to the north of it, and beyond that a further one. So you're going vaulted, all going this way. This is to explain what was revealed on the inside. The Victorians had dry-lined the walls with plasterboard like a piece of shop fitting to tidy it up. The wall was also leaning quite a lot. But after the fire, all of the plasterboard was taken off, what was left of it. There were fire-damaged windows. And you can see the weave of stones of different periods. And the wonderful Scott McCracken and his team from the Southwestern Archaeology Division painstakingly started identifying each stone in the wall by type, period, etc. And then started moving across the ground. And that's when, as I said, I think he wouldn't say, and I wouldn't say, the fun began. That's where it really started to begin, to try and trace the footprint of previous generations of churches on this site, to understand what was here. So you're going from a 900 church, it was all singing and dancing, big organ, gallery and so forth. You suddenly got yourself a huge number of interrelated issues, if not problems. The church started around the time of the Doomsday Book. That's not actually a drawing of it, it's the first of a series, a chain of drawings which explains how this unfolds. But it's, I think you could say, like a bothy. It's a displuviate, big word, Latin, a pitched roof, little humble dwelling for gathering in prayer. That's the next version where it's got a bit bigger and people are obviously gathering in greater numbers. And this is conjecture with a doorway. But that doorway, I think, is the doorway. Now you start to see it growing. It has a chancel and a chapel developing 1215. Not the time, that's dated from archaeology. Now it's gaining a tower. That's the view which we were introduced to, having been appointed. We started to amass images and data about the provenance of the site and the situation and what might have taken place in what order, to unravel, if you will, the mysteries of it. And we were led by that, thinking, wouldn't it be fantastic if in the middle of Barnes, an outstanding conservation area, you could restore a sense, if not the illusion, that it's just a little beautiful medieval church in a churchyard. So that's our first aim. We then found that a banking family, the Hoare family, Hoare, in the 18th century, where are you? I've got my dates here, had decided that sitting at church on a Sunday in 1777 would be more enjoyable if they had their own box pews coming out of the side, and they had, as it were, a private box from which they could attend services. And you'll see they also put 2 chimneys up so they could keep warm in their bit of the church. So you had the residents of Barnes were in the main part and the Hoare family were in their bit. And it obviously caught on that this was better, so or the Hoare family perhaps got very extended. A longer piece was extended back towards the tower, so that you start to get a bigger capacity gathering and a more formality happening at the church. That's the view of the Hoare chapel. What we didn't know until the archaeologist got really into it was that right under where the people who are happily sitting there minding their own business don't realise they're sitting on the Hoare family who are in their vault. And then it got extended with a wholehearted middle aisle. So that got absorbed, the Hoare family vault and the superstructure all got upped. And all of these are east-facing churches, very important. Tradition dictates, habit, word of mouth. Building a church, altar faces east, no-brainer. So we got directional worship. That's a view of it back in the day with its finishes, not quite as elegant as now. And then we have the image of it growing into its final 1905 version, with the vestry poking its nose out that you saw, the little piece down there. And you've got 3 big aisles, and you've got a large window behind an altar, steps up, and the whole of that courtyard, essentially, that you see out of there, is where the altar was, facing east, doing what big Victorian Edwardian churches do. So far, so good. So, to summarise the design intentions, we did a sketch based on that sequence of drawings which we'd initiated, which was that. And I would say it was quite a radical thing to suggest that it's got all the elements we were talking about, and the brief said we'd like to have meeting rooms, we'd like to have some ancillary rooms. We know we're on a tight budget. What do you reckon? And it's like, well, what we reckon is you should make a medieval church down there, and then for the rest, flat roof, keep the profile low, build a garden wall at the back with a roof on it. So you've made an abridged churchyard, and to let the light in, you have a north window, and the what looks like the steps of Jantar Mantar in India. You could have solar collectors. We're talking 1980 at this point. You could have a large wedge of solar collectors that would heat up the new auditorium you've created. And the reaction was as silent as the room is at the moment. And it was many years later, and I'll now refer back to Minster Lovell, which you haven't seen, but in the Cullinan office, the archives were in shirt boxes. Everything was paper, it wasn't scanned and so forth. And I was leafing through one day, and I had lovely pictures of Cotswold this and Cotswold that and Minster Lovell, and I found this wonderful drawing Ted had done, which is a 3D view, not unlike this, which was his first stab, as he would say, at how to design for being by the water next to a Cotswold mill to put in 30 study bedrooms and so forth for a conference centre. And it was basically a miniature version of his scheme for Dennis Lasdon for the University of East Anglia, with flat roof terraces climbing up away as if they were the riverbank. And I think in his mind, he was a decade on from doing that, and the easiest diagram, not the easiest design diagram, but the easiest way to communicate a certain sensibility was this. And we rolled up the drawings and got in the car on the way home, and as quite often happened with me and Ted riding in cars, I said, "You seem to be a bit quiet." And I said, "Is anything the matter?" And he said, "Yes, I'm thinking there's going to be a lot is the matter unless we get back to the office," this was 10 at night, "and start having a much better idea." So we got back to the office and we started having a better idea, which was doing the same thing or demonstrating that the same approach could be taken using a pitched roof. And the principle that's at stake here is that in all of these, we're putting the 300-person capacity church by borrowing space partly in the medieval section and adding the main event, which is broad relationship, not tunnel-like relationship to the service, for people to gather in both of these little mini transit in the round around the service. But what was being lost in that one by making the wings at the back subservient was that they went down to single story. And indeed the interiors at this point we hadn't worked out particularly at all. We knew the broad outlines of what we were doing. So apart from back to the drawing board was back to the site, because the parallel current, Scott McCracken and his team were still excavating. We were a long way into the project by now in terms of knowledge, both conjectural, literal. We were really starting to get to know what the issues were. And we were at our drawing boards, and Ted said, I think it's time to stop drawing. We should just go down to site. And armed not with digital Leica measuring devices, but with a yardstick and 3 tape measures, we decided to spend the day measuring everything in sight. Every piece of stone we could salvage, every tombstone, every angel, whatever. Complete inventory of the salvage yard that we were going to ask be put to one side, because for the money available to do the rebuild, we decided we were going to recycle as much as possible of the building that was here. The other thing that may have been running through Ted Cullinan's mind at that point, he was a devotee. He'd been studying in the Arts and Crafts School at Cambridge University by people who'd actually been practicing in the arts and crafts. But when he'd gone to the AA, and he was aware of Le Corbusier, of course, but he became more passionate about Le Corbusier to the point where in 1954, when the chapel at Ronchamp in the Vosges Mountains was completed, he got on his bicycle in London and cycled to the Vosges Mountains to see it being opened. And later, I mean, this is a wonder of the world. For those of you who haven't been to it, I would urge you to go and see it. Not on bicycle, just usual means. It's extraordinary in a number of ways. It's extraordinary because it's striking, of course. And we've talked about the objectness of a building in one way. It's actually a pilgrim chapel. And it's also, notably, a chapel that's built using the stone and rubble from a chapel that had been a pilgrim chapel on that site, for which the monks and so forth didn't have much money to build anything else. And Le Corbusier, this is towards the end of his life, although it was a life cut short, invented this extraordinary composition, which is a roof floating above elements of walls on a numinous site that you approach and move around and through. And the key thing about it, to me when I visited it, and others have remarked on it as well, so it's not a brainwave, people will say of the Mona Lisa, have you noticed the eyes follow you around the room? When you're in Ronchamp, wherever you are in it, you think you're at the centre of it. If you're on your own in what would be a congregation. Otherwise, wherever you are, it adjusts to capture you. So there's an incredible stillness, and the light is coming from many directions. So although it looks like an object, actually space and light are passing through it from above, from each side, and the orientation illuminates it in different ways at different times of day. Ted Cullinan has done a series of wonderful talks, which you can see, I think, on, if not on YouTube, elsewhere. And they're called TED Talks because he would draw and illustrate as he went. This is a synopsis of one, and in that he builds, in the same way I'm building with these sketches, a timeline and a storyboard. He builds the buildings and it deconstructs them. What's beautiful is that it starts to show a way of making buildings where we used to use the word open form and closed form. Closed form is a medieval church. Open form is this part of the church, which is the counterpoint to that, where each time there's a corner, if I say it's exploded, it's corroded at least, and light filters through and space filters through. The wall panels never actually come up and make a box. They're freestanding. They're disengaged from other elements. And at Ronchamp, the crowning glory is that what looks like a very heavy roof is actually hovering because it's disengaged by light coming in at the top. If you now look at the remnants, you can see where this is going. If you now look at the remnants that we edited down after the fire, The turret had a roof on it. The vestry had several windows that were well worthwhile keeping. The towers, obviously the tower, south wall, and the Langton Chapel, as I call it, the east wall of the little chapel, were all intact, and the chancel arch. And from that point onwards, it became quite clear that what we should do, to us at least, but it required convincing everybody else, was to make a north place with transepts, take those as the set points, the turret and the vestry of the rest of the scheme, use the two columns that had survived the fire, which are just between us, mediate between us and the medieval part of the church. We took the measurements between those out to where they arrived at the tower, found they were 4.8 metres apart. And then one day we sat down and we worked out that everything in the church was working on what I'll say in old money, because it would have been imperial, a 4-foot grid, 4-foot interval, captured everything with the exception of these little side doors here, which suddenly go narrow, and that's the take-up, that's the tolerance. Otherwise, everything is governed by an implicit, in the existing original building, 4-foot grid. At which point, you might say, then the architect's job is done. 4-foot grid, some existing elements, it's fine. The next piece is, you've got those columns, you've got the turret, and you've got the vestry. What is the appropriate thing to put at the end of what you're proposing as a north-facing liturgical space? The appropriate thing is to take the window that's been facing east to underline, to italicize continuity of faith by literally moving that window and placing it in a new wall that's behind the new altar place here. And the next thing to do is figure out how to not go into the ground digging up bodies for which you have to get formal permissions for each and every one. And so we decided that we could, or suggested, and then it was decided, we make a stone pavement like in a cathedral, covering everything that had been discovered, but laid on sand so it could be archaeologically excavated in the future, and make beams that went right across the whole of, we'll call it the churchyard, an interior churchyard, to rest on that wall. That's the plan of what we're sitting in. We get very used as architects, that's our currency. Le Corbusier said, to fix a plan is to have had ideas. And what he means, as I take it from that is the summary of everything I've just been saying up to this point. It's a coded message. It's like the little things you now get to scan when you're checking out at the supermarket. Everything you need to know about what's going on in this building is in that, other than the section through it. So you see the vestry, you see the turret, you see the wall, you see the beyond that I referred to. Very slight beyond, but it's beyond. The window there, and you see the medieval section. And you'll see, importantly, that we've put back here, with a thick wall, a deep wall, the side that had been ripped out of the medieval chancel. But because we were going to heat the building, and there was a boiler, for morning services, we conducted all the heat into the fat wall that's in the chapel there. And the final piece of that jigsaw is to do with how to hold up the roof that was going to be folded out over all of this. And the engineer told us, this is from recollection, so if there are engineers in the house, please don't jump in too fast. We were told a 18-inch deep rolled steel joist would probably do the job. And we didn't think that was the right solution. And the whole idea by now was, how do you capture inside and outside space in a light touch way that gathers people together, that makes them feel they're under a roof that's not bearing down on them, but almost when you have an almond biscuit and you light the wrapper, I don't know if you do that at dinner, it amuses children. And just as it gets to the point of combustion, very bad in a church that's burnt down, you suddenly see it float off like that. And our aim was to make a roof that went up, not down. So we disengaged it from the walls everywhere, and it just floats. The only places it doesn't is where it tethers down like guy ropes on a tent to stop it blowing away. And we designed these trusses, which were made of a box section steel up there, doing the compression, and we've got the blade flying through space that's tying it all together. And to complete that whole device, we use the wall, the beyond wall with the salvaged windows. We put a lantern, and the lantern means that all through the day, as well as the still light from the north in the space, you have the sun coming up, travelling around and going down. So you've got this combination, this intersection of types of daylight, the tree beyond, which we'll see when the screen goes away again, combining to bring stillness into the place that you've now got under a very light roof. This is just briefly, because I'm sure my time is running, is a picture during construction, unpicking the pellets, sort of summary of everything that was going on. 13 builders, one building firm, same 13 people, started on day one, they were still here on the end, and multitasked all the way through, including making the trusses, including making the cross which hangs above the altar, all of it, except for Matt Marchbank, who did a lot of the joinery here, the furniture pieces. But this team were absolutely remarkable. A labour of love. These are technical drawings for those who are so minded, but it gives you an idea of what goes into working out how to make this lightness made of steel and wood actually work. But the reason I flag it up is that the other element in the truss is that you'll see that the pieces of wood look as though they're going for a walk down the room. And it would have been perfectly possible to do trusses that just go zigzag, 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 and were closed form. But already we were by now enjoying the idea that there was freedom in this space. So that once we'd evolved that language for the truss, we started developing that carpentry approach right down through, where it was all about how you made simple cuts in carpentry, like these pieces of furniture, to achieve aesthetic effect rather than decorative effect. They're hard-working pieces of wood, even the one I'm standing on. But every time you come to a corner or a junction in architecture, you have a choice. It's a bit like the Alamo. You're going to step forward, close the form, or are you going to let it be free? Still does the job just as well. It's called the Cartesian node, and Gerrit Rietveld, the carpenter, used it for his famous chairs in the early 1920s. And we were influenced by that, but we were influenced especially by the feeling of lightness it produced. So rather than heavy church joinery, we wanted to maintain the consistency of language and feel right through the building. But right at the bottom right there, I should point out that the wonderful site agent from the building company called Ron Batten, who was a master carpenter, found us not crying in our coffee, but something like it one day in the site hut. And he said, "What's the matter, boys?" And we said, "We've realised there's a better detail to be done at the bottom of the posts, but it's not actually in the tender." And he said, "Well, how does it go?" So we sketched him, which is the resolution of what is the coping stone turned into a complete piece of sculptural object. And he's just shrugged and went, oh, I see. On Monday we came back and he'd made 4 of them, 2 for each of the doorways there, so that at the point where all the carpentry comes down and is finally tied to the ground, it captures the stone that's the crucifix that marks that you're walking into a church, but it's concealed in the carpentry a little. That's what I'm standing on. But it brings together all of those themes, I hope. And even that has the playfulness that if a child wants to read the lesson, they can tip up the flap and put it at or somewhat shorter, they can do that. And I'll just close with these pictures of the interior. When I said we'd meet the angels at the end, hopefully we all will. I'm not joking. You'll see in the left-hand view of the Langton Chapel, there are beautiful curved trusses. This is one kind of system. We reverted to being more faithful to the historic idea of making curved timber trusses. There are 2 different radii because the plan tapers, so it's quite an achievement to take multiple pieces of wood and get that to work well. And what could be more fitting, we felt, than that the angels in the lightness would be bearing the load of the roof coming down and flapping their wings. And that's what you're looking at. And that's the final view there from the outside, from the street view from there. And again, it makes it more of a collection of built form in a hamlet, as I would call it, in the middle of Barnes, than a church, which it could have been. So I'll extinguish that. Closing statements. In the light of this brief review, I hope you'll come to recognise the work, I should say some of, the work behind the work, and the commitment and faith of all of those involved in co-creating this further chapter in a long and continuing historic moment, which is what we're living in, always. And as last word, as Ted Cullinan himself said, in the face of a turbulent public meeting, I will remember, when challenged on why a more traditional design was not being proposed. You must always remember that it is change itself that is traditional. Thank you very much.
Yes, Hugh suggested there's a short break whilst everyone can recharge their glasses if they'd like to do that, and the panel will congregate here near the altar. Okay?
direct, probably. Yeah, I'll keep you copied in, just it's happening. Great stuff.
Okay. Can anybody hear me? Is that out there in the room? Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I've got it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to resume. So bring your glasses to your seats. Resume the conversations later. Hurry along now. I think that one of the things which interested me about that discussion and that presentation that Mark just gave us was the fact that he was talking about making a modern church at the start of the 1980s. And this is what we're in. But what we're in 40 years on is a piece of historic modernism. And I'm interested in the way that such buildings are seen now as being, obviously, from what we do at the 20th Century Society, we're interested in historic modernism and saving historic modernism, not that this building needs saving. Because one thing I must say, and I was so impressed when I first saw it last year, was just how remarkably well it's been maintained. And even down to things you might have seen the display at the back there of, the old seat and the new seat. 40 years of bums on seats has meant that some of the upholstery is starting to go. The new upholstery is almost indistinguishable, but slightly more padded for the modern posterior. But otherwise, exactly the same. And I think it speaks volumes not only for the way the church is looked after, but also for the original design. And there's Matt Marchbank there, who was making...
If you've got a phone on, it's probably...
Yeah, let's put that away. If we're in a sort of historically modern building, what I want to go back for, and for this I'll ask Andrew here, is just how controversial was it at the time? I've read, there were stormy public meetings. I've heard that the poet laureate was brought into play at one point. Was there ever a moment where it seemed like you're just not going to be able to do it?
No, I don't think so. To answer that.
Please.
Yeah, there we are. A quick answer to that is no, but I think that there was, because there was this debate of the people who were generally not members of the church saying it should be built as it had previously existed, and the members of the church said we wanted something for the future. And that was very much Ted's view as well, and Mark's and so on, isn't that right? There were two key people who made sure it got built in this way. Roger Dixon, and they're both commemorated in plaques over there, those black plaques over there. Roger Dixon and Jürgen Simonson. Roger Dixon was the chairman of the rebuilding committee, and he just kept this vision going of making sure that we were for the future rather than the past. Jürgen Simonson was the rector who came in halfway through the process and really made that happen amongst the congregation and the community of Barnes. So I think that I would say, and you can look at our scrapbook at the back there and see some of the press that went on at the time of that controversy. And most of the press was reporting the people who were negative about the thing. But actually there was consistency, and those two people just made it happen.
Can I just add to that? I would say it's absolutely right, though I would say it wasn't a fight, but in a bout, let's call it a bout, that lasted, as I made the point, 4 years of debate, 1 year of building. There were moments where, and I will be candid here, and I think Ted would forgive me. He and I were driving home one day to the office, and we said to one another, do you know what? I think we're probably the only two people left now who still think this is going to happen. Not because there wasn't the desire, not because there wasn't the commitment, it was sheer fatigue at being in round 9 of the bout, and it was still blustering. But, as you say, the chairman and the rector hung in there, and their vision was true. But that's why I made the remark about the prayer, the beginning and the end, where that sense of, okay, let's take a moment and hold it and see, and if it's right, it will happen. And that prevailed.
Now, a further question is, you made a literal liturgical shift to this building. Yeah, well, that's it. And so this I always enjoy. So we had an east-west church, and that's obviously there in the original chapel there. And now we have the thing which I always love because it's called liturgical east, which is in fact there. East just happens to be where the altar is, and that's liturgical east, but it's north. But as far as the church is concerned, that is east. I mean, was that a big debate? Was that, and what was the reason for it?
At the time, I think, this is going to sound, when the cathedrals were white, I keep quoting Le Corbusier today, which means back when they were new, cathedrals and churches, you approached a large piece of space usually and started building them. Which way are you going to put the altar? Tradition, as it became, received wisdom. The Bible says, if you've heard it right, the altar faces east, because that's where, when you're worshipping, you should be facing. Actually, there's no evidence for that, but the received wisdom among those who casually come to it is altars faced east. The strange thing is, when you really look into it, you find that when you're no longer building in a green field any which way, and therefore have that choice, if you're building a new church on a high street and your site happens to be deep and narrow to the front and you walk in the front door, the altars may well be facing north in Tooting or wherever it is on a high street in order to have a church at all. So it isn't church law, but as a received piece of wisdom and tradition, it's a pretty strong current. The way we were able to limbo out of this, not as a wriggle, not as a sleight of hand, is that we were maintaining the church, the altar to the east there. And in fact, we were reinstating it by recreating the whole of the chancel. And there was part of the brief was that the church should be capable of worship by, say, 20 people in the morning and 150 at the weekend when it was eventually built. So therefore, we were actually riding two horses, not as a con. We were being traditional, and then we were responding to present needs with the other axis.
I was just going to say that exactly the same thing happened with the rebuilt Coventry Cathedral after the war, because it was put at right angles to the ruins of the original church. As a result of that, liturgical east suddenly became something else again.
Liturgically, just as important was involving the congregation. So having the width, and therefore having the involvement and having the possibility of congregation at the side, surrounding the altar area, was just as important liturgically. And being able to do that has been fantastic in practice. Much more involvement of people, much closer to the action, if you like, and much more involving of the congregation. And in addition to that, what part of the brief that was there was that the church could be used for the community. And you may have been touching on that, want to touch on that, but that was part of the brief, and we have been able to use this church wonderfully for events, festivals, concerts, debates, a charity ball, a fashion show, and so on, because we've got the width. And that has been equally as important, not only liturgically, but in community terms.
Now, at this point, I must introduce Claire Price here, who we haven't introduced yet. Claire is our senior caseworker at the 20th Century Society for about one more day. So this is her last engagement with the 20th Century Society before she moves on into the church, in fact, to work there, church house at any rate. And the thing about Claire is that she has a very particular specialism in modern churches. By modern, I mean interwar, post-war, and so forth. And I'm interested in knowing to what extent was this a one-off, and to what extent does it fit into a kind of continuum of church architecture in the post-war years? I mean, bearing in mind that Ted had, I believe, not done a church before, or if he had, he hadn't been built. So he was starting from scratch in the end of the 1970s. Were other people doing the same sort of thing?
Well, that's a very interesting question here, and it depends exactly when you're asking that question about. So in terms of reimagining churches where something catastrophic had happened, there were various ones around about the same time. Actually, one pretty close, St Mary Putney Bridge, which was reimagined by Ronald Sims, who was previously George Pace's partner and George Pace, of course, an amazing post-war architect. And then a little bit later in the decade, people might know St Paul Haringey by Inskip and Jenkins, which was a completely new and reimagined church after the old one burnt down, and possibly the only one you could call properly postmodern. But in terms of a continuity in design ideas and styles, I think, yes, there sort of is really. And you've got a completely different situation going on in the 1980s than you had since Victorian times. Actually, there's quite a lot of church building in the 20th century. People don't really realise that. After the First World War, there was a massive push to build churches on new metro land estates. So you have huge suburban developments going up, and all of the denominations wanted to minister to what they aptly named the godless suburbs. So you got a lot of building, and quite often you ended up in a situation where the suburbs were subsuming a parish with a tiny medieval church. And one of the sort of barn-like quality of this building here reminds me a little bit of the little church in Greenford, Holy Cross, which was a tiny little medieval church, and they couldn't possibly cope with the influx that they had around them with the new estates being built. So Sir Albert Richardson was brought in and asked if he could extend it, at which point he said, "No, I can't, but what I'll do is I'll build you another church." And he built another church next door and joined it up. And it is this amazing wooden latticework barn-type creation that has the same sort of almost unfinished effect with the latticework of timbers going through it, right next door to a medieval church. So that was in the 1930s. And then after the Second World War, you had post-war estates went up, and a lot of rebuilding happened after the war. Quite a few of those, especially in the city, for example, were done as perfect copies. Albert Richardson, again, at St James's Piccadilly, had the fortune to have sketched it as an architectural student and had complete drawings of every part of it. So he redid it, and then he had a few of his own flourishes, which were a little bit controversial after all. But then you had a situation where a massive interest in church architecture with new buildings, with the liturgical movement, which we've touched on here, and the idea of bringing everybody around the altar. So you ended up with churches that became unusual shapes as they tried to accommodate this, bringing people around the altar. And then you get into the later 60s, you get to 1970, and really everyone who's wants a church has got a church by this stage. So you end up in a situation where the churches built after that are very specific situations, a lot of them. There's still growth, there are still new suburbs, new estates being expanded, and you've even got a new cathedral, the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Middlesbrough from 1987, believe it or not. And you do get new churches, but new churches have taken on a completely different persona. And there's a massive, massive effect, which isn't very often talked about, of the ecumenical movement at this point. You get a lot of churches who want to cohabit, for want of a better word. So you end up with interdenominational churches, which also feature community centres. So lots of new estates end up with a community centre come Methodist Church, come Church of England Church, all combined in one thing. Great idea, but they tend not to be very architecturally distinctive. So at the Society, we don't come across them very often, to be fair. And then you do get other situations. There's this really amazing little church in Wetherby, right on the main road as you go through the town, which was a Roman Catholic church, and they ran out of space. So they got in an architect, Steinlet, to expand it, and he built between the old church and the old church hall this amazing modern building, which he then keyed into the old building in a similar way to here, although the effect is completely different. And again, they changed the orientation of the building. Changing the orientation of the building has become something that's actually much more common now. A lot of church reorderings now do this, but they do it within their own building. One of the ones that caused a bit of controversy when it happened about 10 years ago was St Ebbs in Oxford, where they reorientated and made everybody face through the arcades to the side aisle. But that way they could then have more services in the round and that sort of thing. So that's where I see it sits.
I can tell you that's a career summary going on, right there. You've got the job. I wanted to ask Matt here, you're part of all this, because Matt, who's sitting in the front row there, a joiner, a designer himself, has worked in Canterbury Cathedral. He's worked in St Martin in the Fields. He's worked for Anish Kapoor, he's worked for Hayward Gallery, so you will see his stuff everywhere. For this commission, was there sort of a sense that it's time to move on from what churches normally do? Was everything designed to the last sort of millimetre by the Cullinan studio, or did you have a say in it? Actually, I need to bring you a microphone.
You have a chair.
To be honest, I was very lucky to be asked to make anything for this church. I think I was local to the office in Camden Town, and I'd got to know Mark and Ted a bit, and they were keen to, I think, help me along my way, as it were, as much as anything. And I was very keen, and I am still keen to make things, of course. But Ted would produce drawings that I think Mark would tidy up a little bit more, and we just made as accurately as possible what Ted and Mark had drawn. And sometimes, there were odd details that didn't seem to work, and conjunction with metalworkers and other things were sometimes a little bit unknown. And I think Ted has not finished the hinges on the gate over there yet. He said he was going to draw some hands on there, and he hasn't quite finished them yet. So
Grasping hands hold the pivoting bookcase which swings.
It's the gates to the tower.
The tower. Both have these pivoting hands,
Yeah.
and they were going to be interlocking.
They're supposed to have a hand painted.
Yeah, black and white.
Oh, yeah?
Interlocking.
Yeah, it's a detail that Ted's done elsewhere, I think. No?
In his mind, I think. But the metalwork is cut out in the silhouette, anticipating it
Yeah.
to this day.
But it was... That's yeah. But anyway, yes, and Mark would come up with other projects as the years went by, so there were other things that got built as well, fonts and font covers and whatever, bits and pieces. It was an enjoyable and nice experience, and I appreciate it. Thanks.
What I'll do now, there may be people in the audience here who want to ask questions, in which case we will come to you with a microphone. I will do this time. You will do that this time. If you have a question, just stick your hand up. Yeah. If you don't, then sort of, that's fine as well. But if you do, now's the time. We have architects, we have church experts, we have joiners, we've got, exactly, clients and everybody. I had one which came out of the performance thing. Sorry, it's me again, but I'm just trying to get these people going. There's one there, okay. Simply about the performance thing, which was before you go, which is, it's a thrust stage we're on here. Was it, right back at the beginning, was the performance aspect a key part of the brief? Did you want a thrust stage performance?
Well, I think key part of the brief was it could be used by the community.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure about performance. We have done that very much, used this as a stage. And the great thing is that everything is movable. And that, I have to say, from a user point of view, has been fantastic. So that when we're holding a fashion show in here, then the altar doesn't stay there, it moves. Yeah. When we're holding a ball in here, all the chairs move, and we bring in other chairs. When we're running a music festival here, the piano gets put up at that top level for when we've got performances from people like the Canny Mason Trio, as we had last month. And so that, from a user point of view, that actually has been that the most useful thing has been that we can move everything. And so it is a performance space. And although I'm not sure if that was part of the brief, but it has worked out to be the case.
I'll do the loud hater thing. Interestingly, a matter I didn't touch on particularly, there's so many things one could say about it all, but is that architects become fluent in languages. When I was training, you had to become fluent in imperial, that's feet and inches, and metric, because it was at the crossover point. You become familiar with how wide a door tends to be, or what the rise and going on a stair is. You just know this stuff, because you do it lots. Dimensions, how thick a piece of wood needs to be to look dainty. Could be quite fat. Take 6 mil off it, or a quarter of an inch. Looks a lot better. That's what we'll do. And what's amazing is, on doing a church, you suddenly discover implicit in this terrain here, because I remember drawing it, you have to go back to the ergonomic books for the rituals, the progression, kneeling, all of those things, the rites, R-I-T-E, of the liturgy, have dimensions attached. So what's wonderfully encouraging to hear Andrew saying is, do you know what? And when you take the altar off and all the furniture, it turns out to be just the right size for the Canny Masons to play on.
I guess my question's quite appropriate after Andrew's little spiel about what the church is used for. At the time of the design, what consideration did you give to acoustics, and did you think about the effect of the wood particularly as opposed to something else for the ceiling?
Yes, we're not acousticians as such, but I can recall clearly that when we began to, having conjectured the structure of it and so forth, pretty early on, we knew this would be a panelled ceiling made of wood. We also arranged it such that the way the wood is attached to the rafters, these panels that are between, is far less than you would think. I suspect that in common casual construction, someone with an electric nail gun, pop gun as we call them, with the gas, puff, 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 they'd just be firing it all up in there. Be really rigid. These are actually held up only sufficiently to keep them up there. I'm not trying to alarm Andrew. But it means there's resonance in them. They are actually responding. And the church is right next door to what was Olympic Studios, which therefore home to recording engineers and so on. And from very early on, it became very popular for musicians to play here because it was a responsive environment for live performance. Equally, the Collins organ, the tracker organ that you see standing there, is not a lurching organ driven by electronics. It's actually direct drive. It's more like an organ come harpsichord in the sense of how it works with all the visible moving parts. And that again, Peter Collins, who designed the organ, was very pleased with the acoustics from the get-go.
Hang on, there we go.
What sort of wood is it? It's the sort of wood that you would see used for making pallets by the side of the road. But obviously, they're not broken up pallets. It's sawn softwood, but it's been treated, all of the wood was tinted, all of the wood in the interior. It's Douglas fir for all the main structural elements, and it's white wood, basically, pine white wood, but it's been treated with a 20-to-1 dilution of light oak stain before it's assembled, so that it mellows down and doesn't go orange. It goes the other way. So it's to balance out the colours in the ceiling. And then the rafters and struts are all colour-coded according to a principle we had for hot colours and colder colours, depending on what job they were doing.
Hello. Can I just ask a quick question about the lighting and how much of that is original and how much has had to be changed for the various different events that the venue is or the church is now used for?
If you look at the photo that was shown on the publicity for this event, it shows a very different lighting system. And then Ted and Mark then designed this system, which you can see with these discs here. And that was fine for a bit. But it turned out that there wasn't enough light for the congregation, so it was then subsequently adapted to put in these lower ones here and actually add the lighting further up. And also add lighting, which we've got effectively here, stage lighting coming onto the altar area, which wasn't in the original but came out of what the requirements were and were developed. And the key thing to me was that it is done, I hope, as subtly as possible so that you don't see the difference. So it's very much integrated into the way in which the rest of the architecture is. And it's one of the things I've been keen to do along with Phil over here, to really make sure that anything that we develop in the church, like the lighting, the sound system, and so on, is as true as possible to the original design and doesn't conflict with it, but works with the original design.
Do we have any other questions?
Sorry,
Yes,
the
one over
original,
there.
can I just add, the original design for the lights was paper shades costing, I think, £3 each, because the budget for the job was such that having elaborate light fittings at that point, or purpose-made, just wasn't there. So we put in conical shades, which are the most basic light, but that basically responds to the slopes of the roof. So they nested nicely. Inevitability, there you are, until we devised these.
As a regular user of this church, Sunday by Sunday, and obviously knowing it for musical, cultural events as well, I sit in this main space and look northwards and see these huge, great buttresses, or what appear to be buttresses. I've looked at all the illustrations in the magazines about what's inside them. I'm always intrigued. What is it? Are they just camouflaging gas flues, or are they steelwork inside, or voids? Because they seem to be of such a massive, massive strength, which seems to be at odds with so much of the lightness of the rest of the building. What goes on inside them?
Okay, shall I tell you? Shall I leave you in suspense? So, they are, firstly, there's a concrete column concealed in behind this brickwork here, receiving the loads from the trusses arriving up there. The rest is a chamber which is accessible from outside that had on each side an enormous an industrial gas fan blower, and that has got return air ducts, which is what all these grills are here. And there used to be you'll see it in very early photos of the church, a casing here which had diamond-shaped air grills to let blown warm air from either side fill the church for about well, as long as necessary, but maybe an hour before the Sunday service, on the idea that people would be warm for the service, and then the church would go back down to ambient. It was heavily insulated for its time, but there wasn't enough budget, and there wasn't enough confidence about how big a congregation there would be returning to worship after 5 years. So it was decided to use the 2 blowers, and the old boiler was used, as I say, in the fat wall, as I call it, of the Langton Chapel, to let air in there. So you had a sort of night storage feel down there for the morning service, but for Sundays or events or weddings, then you heated the room up for the event. Over time, that then got replaced by the trench.
Yeah, because it didn't work, basically. So it was Max Fordham's design, which was very good in terms of design, but unfortunately didn't work, and it was noisy because it was fan-driven. So we did then replace it, as you can see, with grills and underfloor heating. So we had to take up all the floors and so on, do that. But it's been left, therefore, this architectural shape, as it were, which is fine. But it's been much more effective, especially as we use the church much more than just for a 10 o'clock service.
Any other questions? One at the back, right there. Shall I go this time, Andrew? I feel bad that I'm making you run around all the time. There you go.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting to hear the backstory of not only the political environment at the time, but also how long it took to do it all. And my question is this: you've shown us lots of hand-drawn drawings, and just looking around, just this evening alone, everywhere one looks is made up of at least 5 or 6 members of, whether it's steel, timber, huge amount of thought has gone into every corner in here. And this is a time before CAD was live. And I'm just wondering, and you mentioned you knew the 13 people that put it together from day one till completion. And I'm wondering, A, how many drawings you did, and B, how often you were here, and whether you had a little cabin that you stayed at night.
Excuse me, are you by any chance an architect?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
We drew everything. We test everything by drawing it, we imagine it, we sketch it, we develop it, we draw it again. We go and talk to the people like Matt Marchbank, who are makers and highly inventive makers. And if I can put it this way, we draw always this hypothesis and test and put it out there, and we're prepared to take informed criticism and then work it back until we feel we've got it about as right as we can in the time, in the budget. And many people might say that, but you could think maybe it was overworked. But I loved what you said, and not to shortchange you on the answer. You brought up a thing that at a previous situation many years ago, soon after we'd done finished the building, and people were interested in it, and it was being very well received in colleges and so forth. Someone asked me, how did we come to get it like that? And I said, just by concentrating very, very, very hard and spending huge amounts of time, because we care enough. And they said, why is that? And I said, because when I was a child and went to church, and I, like Ted, was a Catholic and then agnostic, so I had that semi-belief in the beyond. What is the beyond? I would spend a lot of time in churches from the 1960s, particularly, in the suburbs, as children would, listening to the Latin, not understanding it, and looking around. And everywhere I looked, I'd see things that were interesting. And when we came to do this, I knew that if you're in a church and you're just wondering, if you look around everywhere and it all seems to have been taken care of because someone's been there first and brought it into some resolution, then that makes it feel much more a meditative and balanced space for reflection. So what you might think was simple obsession, which it is partly, I'll confess, also has that point to it. What's the point of trying to get it as right and resolved? And that's why there's this language in this building, in this room we're in, and indeed that's carried through to all the transepts and so forth. You keep meeting things and you start to learn Barnes. It should feel like that in here, in our view. So, sorry, long answer to a
We
question.
have to draw things to a close now. I'd like to say firstly sort of thank you to all of you, because it's a really good audience this evening, which shows a lot of interest in the local community and beyond from our normal parish supporters, so to speak. I'd say, just before I conclude, if you're interested in the work of the 20th Century Society, as obviously you must be, otherwise you wouldn't be here, please consider joining us, and you'll find cards at the back telling you how to do that. If you want to look at what we do, check out our website, the books and things which are available there. And I'll just conclude, this is actually, it's a shame you couldn't be here, Ken Powell, who did this book. This was fairly recent, just published last year, monograph on Edward Cullinan architects. And at the end of that, he says that for Ted Cullinan, the Barnes project epitomised his belief in a living tradition in architecture, something you've referred to, one that needs to be inventive and energetic, to be liberating, to respond to the present, to create futures. The opposite to the debased use of the word traditional to mean nostalgic. Now that's very much the line that Ted tended to go along. But what it then concludes by saying, and this is very interesting that those words are written in the 150th anniversary of the birth of William Morris, the arts and crafts pioneer, of course. He says that the Barnes Church can stand as a memorial to all of Cullinan's work, with its materiality, its balance of heavy bass and light soaring roof, and above all, the way it fits perfectly in its setting. So in a sense, this is distilled Cullinan you're sitting in this evening. That's a good quote to end on, I think, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hugh, for hosting and for chairing this discussion. I'll just add one thing, that Mark mentioned the archaeological work that was done by Scott McCracken, who's sitting here in the middle with his beard. And he is coming back here to St Mary's to give a talk about the archaeology on the 11th of June. So if anyone wants to hear more about the archaeology and his archaeological survey back at the time, just after the fire, which Mark picked up on, and the architecture picks up on very much, as you implied, there are some leaflets about that at the back. Thank you.
step down.